I'm Anthony, an ex-guru. I'm going to be hosting the Instagram book club this evening for an hour, where we're going to be talking to Ian Duhig about his new book, New and Selected Poems, published on Picador, and Stephanie Sy-Quia, Amnion, published on Granta. I think we'll do Ian first. We'll chat to Ian. I have my questions, I have my curiosities, my provocations, and we'll see. We've got people tuning in from Bangladesh. Amazing. International. That's it. And then we'll see how we go from there. So we'll go with Ian first, and then we'll do Stephanie. So I'm going to see if I can invite Ian in, if he's here. If not, then I'll just have to try and fill up the space. I'll request to join. This one, isn't it? All right, let's find Ian. Invite. Woo. Been a good day. Hope everyone's all right. Everyone's relaxed. There's Ian. We are rocking.
Hi, Anthony.
How you going, man?
Not too bad.
Good, good. All working? You hear me all right?
Yeah. Is the sound all right at your end?
Yeah. I think it's pretty. I'm turning the volume up on the old iPhone here.
Yeah.
See how we go. But yeah, I think it's fine. Yeah, great bookshelves.
Oh, yeah. That's it. I'm showing off, you see, just to prove that I actually do read, you know.
Yeah, you have to. I usually have that background, but it always looks like I'm in a bit of a hospital. So I just move it that way to show I'm learned. So yeah, a bit of the old cultural currency.
I'm behind a massive TV.
There it is. The plasma, 88 inch. Yeah.
This is what I'm really interested in. Anyway.
That's what you want. Congrats on the book.
Thank you very much.
Congrats. Beautiful. It's a really beautiful book, actually. Like, I love the design. I was looking at who designed it, Neil Lang. Yeah, it's great. It's a Poetry Book Society recommendation for those of you who can see it. Beautiful looking book. So I've been reading it over the last few weeks, dipping in and out, looking at the various stages of like your writing, because it's like over 30 years now, right? Where you've been, and what is it, 7 collections?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And this is number 8, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the thing that first came to my mind, because, you know, when I try and formulate these questions, I try and like focus on the things that I would be interested in. And I guess the first thing that I had written down was, well, the first thing that I wanted to know was, how's your relationship to your subject changed over 30 years, to the things that you like to write around?
Yeah. Well, my first book was written, I was still working in the homelessness field. I mean, I don't come to poetry from an academic background. And in my first book, lots of the poems are from all over the world. I mean, I am genuinely interested in all or everything, frankly, but other countries, other histories. But it was also, I was writing it to get away from my day-to-day job. I would sort of get some relief from writing a poem about relations to Italy or something like that, or maybe China. And then I was made redundant from a drugs hostel, and I thought I'd have a go at being a writer. And then I became more relaxed about writing things that were where I was surrounded by the inspiration and the ordinary circumstances of my life, but with greater, you know, echoes. So that's really, it does reflect what's happened in my life, and that change has been the big one, really.
Do you think that working, because, you know, like, there's so many poems around the idea of the family, the idea of memory, there's so many poems that work off memory, childhood memories, growing up. I'm assuming it was parts of Ireland, right, where you were growing up. Is that right, or am I just reading into that wrong?
I was the first one. There was 11 kids. I was 11 kids, and I was the 8th, and I was the first one born in England.
Right.
So I was born in London, Having said that, I don't write a lot about my childhood. I know people say that that's your endless capital. I have a couple of poems about my, but nothing really direct.
Yeah.
My worry, I have to say, is that I just don't think that I am in myself that interesting. I'm interested in all sorts of other things. And I am obviously the person who is processing and relating that experience to the writing. But in myself, I don't think I am a particularly interesting person.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. In that, one of the, I think, you know, when we talk about the I lyric or using I or any kind of confession or autobiographical poetry, you're always up against that thing of, is my life interesting enough? Is there enough tension? Have I lived through in it as many things? But just hearing you say that, because I mean, you do use first person a lot. Like, there is a lot of I's in this, and there's poems about your sister or about your friend. Which one I really liked, actually, the one where you have to put the mouth on his wound. What was that one in? It was in Out of Boredom. Out of Boredom. Yeah, that was a great poem. And I think that, like, the way that you navigate masculinities and friendship and boyhood and that kind of rural element to it as well, how it balances all those things, was really quite remarkable, actually.
Oh, Brad, thank you very much for that. I should say, I'm glad you like that poem, but it wasn't actually my experience. Jean-René Lassalle, who the poem is dedicated to, was a soldier stationed in East Germany.
Right.
And we did an exercise. We went out and we got people to share moments in their childhood. And Jean-René Lassalle wrote something based on that, and I wrote the poem based on what he'd done, and he saw it, obviously. But the lyric I mean, although I'm not interested in myself, I'm interested in the lyric because as soon as you start doing that, something interesting happens. It's never the same as of yourself. Sometimes it overlaps. Say the last poem in the book is about a singer in Leeds who died young. He had many problems. I'm sitting next to the window that he put in, which the poem talks about. But at the end of that poem, I mentioned that, you know, when you're getting a new window put in, it's incredibly cold. I talk about the invasion of the cold, but the invasion is in some way linked to Northern Ireland and the historical context of Northern Ireland and the fact that Ireland was invaded. And it's a cold place for Catholics. But so there is me. I mean, it's me trying to sort of open the ground for the singer, really. And different eyes in the book will be different people. They may be me, they may be close to me, they may be very far away from me. I'm interested in trying to understand experience of people who I actually might not like, or I might find kind of repulsion, bad people. And in a way, we have that heritage. I mean, we're talking about people from all over the world. You look at the legacy of the British Empire, you know, it is wherever you go. I was looking at something today about, there's a new academic study about how they have finally disproved that the English weren't involved in massacres in Paraguay. But nevertheless, the assumption is, because they have been involved in so many massacres in the past, that they're quite likely to have been, you know. So to take on board some kind of, you know, not to be sort of avoiding historical responsibility, not to be avoiding complex histories and your place within it, white privilege, you benefit from simply inheriting a particular colour of skin. You don't suffer what other people do for no other reason than this is just the way you came into this world. That does interest me. That interests me profoundly. And I try and investigate it in my poetry in a way which is interesting to other people. I think if people are just bored by what you're doing, it's a waste of time, you know.
Hmm. So I guess that kind of brings in the question of transgression. You know, like we talk about morality, the function of morality in art, and art holding a moral space. But then how do we write about unsavory characters, about people who are repulsive, about men who have done horrible things throughout history? How do we, as artists, what the kind of sensitivity and concern and consideration? I mean, it's a big question, right? And I think, you know, there's a lot of writing around, like philosophical and academic writing around that kind of endeavor. But I think persona writing, from what you were describing, it sounds like persona writing as a kind of mode, particularly in this day and age, with a lot of contemporary poetry, maybe from the last 10 years, hasn't really seemed to be as in vogue as what it might have been in the 70s or in the 80s, where poets, musicians, you know, I think Bob Dylan, you know, the Hurricane song, of adopting first person the experiences of another individual, be it a black person, a queer person, a working class person, whatever it might be. How do you feel about those kind of, is it appropriation? Is it a form of storytelling, and the function of that?
I can see all those reservations, and the very justified reservations people have about it. Say, for example, the persona poem I'm thinking about now is about Haiti, the Haitian rebellion. The persona I adopt is not any of the black revolting slaves. The persona I adopt is one of the white overseers. I mean, that may be questionable in itself, but nevertheless, I do feel that if you don't try and take on or speak for suffering that you can't imagine, I have some insight into bigotry. You know, I grew up in a family, and occasionally, you know, when it was a working class family, you inherit bigotry, and you certainly did in my time. But it's not that hard for me to understand something of bigotry. It would be very hard for me to understand the pain of a lot of people, but I can see that it's wrong. So my way into it will often be through understanding, or at least an aspect of the behavior of people who are doing these things. The very first job I had when I came to Leeds, the head of security was one of the police who was sent to jail for a campaign of torture, basically, of a Nigerian immigrant called David Olawale. And I'm still involved with the David Olawale charity. His fate haunted me. But I never saw David, but I saw the person who tortured him, and in all likelihood was probably instrumental in him going into the water for his death, you know. And seeing that he was on the receiving end of it. I mean, racism is a white problem. I mean, it's black people on the receiving end of it. But, you know, it's like, it's done to them. And to understand racism, you must understand white people, because by and large, privileged people are the ones who are visiting it on other people. And that is something I do have some insight into, because look at me, I'm white, you know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think because, you know, there's a lot of white poets who have tried to write about whiteness, and that kind of, sometimes it's done well and sometimes it's not done very well, and it comes out the other end. But I guess this is a question for another kind of discussion. But I'm interested in the dynamic, the power dynamic in particular, when a white writer takes on whiteness and black people become the subject of that person's exploration of whiteness, and so the white speaker is central in the poem, but black pain and black suffering, or you know, Muslim pain, Muslim suffering, Asian pain, Asian suffering, is the kind of thing that is used, perhaps exploited if it's not done well enough, to kind of land the point. And I think this is where it fails. I you know, Claudia Rankin and other people have written amazing essays on poems that get it right and then poems that get it wrong. Is there a kind of, what's your approach to something like, because it's so tenuous, right? Like one wrong move and the whole thing goes wrong. So what's your approach to that kind of thing?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances that you're writing for. If you're writing a narrative, say you're writing a narrative and you're telling a story, like stories, say David Oluwale, for example, you're talking to people who don't, you're talking to people who may have known it and have forgotten it, or people who are avoiding it, and then you're just bringing forward information. It speaks for itself. It speaks for itself. On other occasions, say like the Haitian thing, it's not, the black people are out of the picture because they're not really, they're the victims of what happened to them in Haiti. I mean, it's still a ruined society. But they're still, I mean, I think they're still paying reparations to France.
Yeah.
From that time.
Yeah.
So my focus there is on the occupiers. With an Irish heritage, to a certain extent, you have this attitude, you have a peculiar attitude in this country, because obviously they occupied Ireland, you know, loads of us are over here. Because of that, because of, you know, a devastated population, a ruined economy. I was talking to someone recently that my name in Ireland is fairly rare, but the further you get away from Ireland in the world, the more of us there are. There's more in England than there is in Ireland, more again in America, and there's in Australia. So again, overlaps. Of course, Scottish and Irish people benefited from the empire in the old days. You have to take that on board as well. So sometimes it's a question of where you stand in relation to that. You know, the Irish people can be victims of the English and have been in them, but by the same token, as I say, Irish people and Scottish people benefited from the empire. Were involved in the armies of the imperial forces. I think something like 48% of Nelson's flagship were Irish sailors. You know, a large proportion of Wellington's army were Irish. Scots regiment, very famous all over the world. So it shifts. I think it does depend on the circumstances, and you do have to be careful. I'm a big fan of Claudia Rankine. And I think technically, one of the things, Citizen was the one which really got me, but what she did within that technically was interesting. And I think part of what was going on there is information that if you come from a minority community that you have to put before the world, because simply people are just not interested in your community. They do not. If you come from a dominant community, that's out there and everyone can pretend that that's normal, but you don't need to explain that. And people will object to the fact that you have information in poems. But depending on your background, your information will not be known. People will not know who you are and where you're coming from. So it's a very, very difficult thing, and it will change in time. Things did change from when I started writing to now, and they will change again.
Yeah. What's your, because I was reading some of the newer poems actually at the back of the book, and it's interesting how you use rhyme. Like there's such a heavy kind of like rhyme scheme. Like in some of the poems, it's more prevalent than others. But it's something again that I thought, oh, we don't really see a lot of that in kind of contemporary poetry. Like those kind of very clear iambics and that very nice kind of metered line. What's your thinking around that? Is there a particular reason that you just like kind of rhyme and rhythm in that sense? Or I was really interested in that actually.
Well, I think that is something, it's more problematical in America. If anybody wants to sort of have a look on my Twitter timeline, I shared an essay about that. And the view in America very much used to be the case that rhyme, meter was associated with reactionary politics. But it's not the same over here. Rhyme and rhythm was often associated with radical politics. Tony Harrison,
Adrian Mitchell,
and all the rest of it. And the people I work with, I mean, I did draw an analogy. When I come up the Chapeltown Road, at the bottom of Chapeltown Road where I used to run workshops, the people who went there, these Irish Alton Holmes, they wrote in rhyme, meter. That's how they tried to write. About halfway up the road, things began to change, you know. And then when you get to the sort of slightly richer area, my local MP was very keen to tell me that his son wrote experimental poetry, you know, that he writes the up-to-date good stuff, you know, and that is indeed the stuff of the rich community and in universities. So I think the mechanism of the occupation of poetry, now almost completely by universities, has to be borne in mind about when you consider these technical aspects. You know, outside universities, in poorer communities, rhyme, meter, in Ireland, where the relationship with song is still important. And the relationship with song is important throughout my book, and in the new poems as well. So all of these things feed into it. And as you say, it's not that common. So I feel that I've got quite a lot of room to myself in that.
Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, it was really interesting to see that difference. But I think your subject matter is that I like the term a social historian that's written in the blurb to kind of describe the work. And I think there is a kind of chronicling that happens, that has been happening throughout your 30 years of writing. It feels that you're kind of, you're there, like it's the speakers are very present in the world, in the political landscape, and you can kind of see how things have changed and different conflicts and feuds and kind of things that have been going on within different periods are all there in some way as kind of preservation. And that was the last thing I was going to ask before I asked you to read a poem, was how important is preserving the time, being a kind of chronicler, being a documenter, an archivist. How important are those things to the job of the poet and to the job of poetry?
Well, I think it's different for different poets. For me, I felt it incumbent on me that people who would have been forgotten, stories that would have been forgotten, that I knew, that I was a witness to, I felt it was incumbent on me to preserve those in some way and pass them on. But there's a million ways of writing poetry. I mean, this is not a particularly important thing to do. I mean, I felt it was, but other people don't, you know, or the same thing in a way. You know, Zong, that fantastic way that she takes the documents apart, and you get fragments of documents, and that preserves the story. That preserves the story of the slave massacre in a different way.
Yeah,
important for me.
Yeah, I think the distinction is like, even with Lady Long Soldiers, whereas, you know, where she takes Barack Obama's apology and she completely kind of goes to town on it. I think there's preserving things historically and things that are known, or maybe things that are not so known. But I guess there is something really intimate about your poetry, and that it spans throughout the collections. There's something that feels very much entrenched in those communities, from not just a kind of theoretical lens, but from a humanist perspective. Like, it feels it's very there with those communities who the poems are concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, that's
right,
true.
Yeah.
I'm glad that comes across. I mean, that was my intention, you know, to sort of be close to them. You know, not for it to be just material, but to sort of, in some way, give a flavour of involvement with those communities.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to that whole subject of persona poetry, you know, like how close are you, what is your proximity to the thing that you're writing about? You know, how close are you to your subject? Is it just, did you read a Guardian article and think, I want to write a poem about being a refugee? Or is it something more profound? You know, I think that's where I sit with it anyway. When it comes to how I assess that nexus between poet and subject, its proximity is a big part in that. Do you want to read a poem or two from the book? We've got about 5 minutes on the clock, so it'd be great to hear some stuff.
Okay, well, I'll start with a poem called Time, It relates to the cover of the book. It's the first poem in the new poem selection. And today is the 25th anniversary of the death of the great Gaelic poet Sawney MacLean. It refers to a poem of his, Harlaig, Gaelic name. It's a deserted community by the clearances, from the Highland clearances. This poem, indeed rhymed meter, isn't so much located with people. When you're talking about being close to people, this time, this is nature. This is a kind of an imagined voice of nature. Tinny and Wadrarua, which I mentioned here. Tinna is in Irish means fire. Tinna and Wadrarua means foxfire, literally the fire of the red dog. I am the deer of 16 tines, more than your monarch of the glen. I set horns on the heads and words in the brains of women and men. Tinna means fire in Tinna and Wadrarua, foxfire, will-o'-the-wisp, or jack-o'-lantern. My lights breathe out on your page-white moor where poems burn. I am time fled from Harlaig wood. Your seconds are my second-hand clothes. You walk through curtains of hide for the word no human knows. I am the deer of many points, all too dark for your brightest mind. The points of poetry, of arguments, of weapons, and of being kind. My dark blood fills your books. The white of my eye behind each page looks beyond where your poet or sorcerer looks, to curse your age. This poem is called The Names of the Plague. It was a project about the racialization of pandemics. It's after a Middle English poem. So the names of the plague: the blame gamer, the ill shamer, the brave killer, the grave filler, the buck passer, the eyeglasser, the sight saver, the night raver, the faith shaker, the rule breaker, the duff ruler, the bluff fooler, the world beater, the word eater, the first aider, the worst paider, the spit sailor, the inhaler, the high fever, the deep griever, the dry cover, the hat duffer, the cold creeper, the old reaper, the youth wrecker, the truth checker, the head cracker, the lost tracker, the host racer, the slow tracer, the job loser, the lost boozer, the cramped homer, the spread coma, the room slayer, the doomsayer, the sick tricker, the nit picker, the mad chatter, the foil hatter, the mask hater, the nurse baiter, the flock fleecer, the palm greaser, the deal lander, the backhander, the wrong richer, the song hitcher, the rhyme rider, the time bider. Its chief name is Legion.
Oh wow, yeah, that's fantastic.
And,
yeah, that's
have
the
we got
whole
time for any more? Is that it?
Yeah, you can do one more. Did you want to do one more? Are we good?
Is there time for one more, or should we finish here?
Actually, you know what? I want to read your bio. So I'm going to read your bio because I never got to read it at the beginning. So give me a minute. I'm going to read Ian's bio here because I think it's a great bio. Actually, I think it's pretty fantastic. Ian Duhig worked with homeless people for 15 years before becoming a writer, and he's still actively involved with minority and marginalised groups on artistic projects. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the how do you say that? Cholmondeley.
Oh, Chumley.
How do you say it?
Chumley.
Chumley
no,
Award recipient. Yeah, I was trying to work out how that would sound. Chumley Award recipient. Ian Duhig has won the Forward Prize for Best Poem once, the National Poetry Competition twice, and has been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize 4 times. He lives in Leeds with his wife, Jane. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. And yeah, you can buy Ian's book on the PBS website as well. His new and selected poems that I would thoroughly recommend. It's absolutely a mammoth book. You can get 30 years of dedicated to the craft in that. So yeah, fantastic, and thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to bring Stephanie in now.
Cheers,
Let me
everybody.
see if she's here. Thanks very much, Ian. See if Stephanie's here, and see how we go.
Cheers.
Oh, there she is. Hi, Steph.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Ian, for your beautiful reading. I mean, the linguistic texture of your poems is just such a joy to behold.
Yeah, and to the ears as well. Those sounds. I haven't heard that kind of rhyming go on for ages. That was fantastic. I'm going to read your bio at the end as well. I think it just makes a change from having to read bios first. How are you, Stephanie?
Yeah, good. I mean, there's a lot less on my bio than on Ian's. Ian's is very cool, and I have much less to say for myself.
No, it's all good. I want to get to that point where you just do what Anne Carson does, and you say like, Anne Carson lives in Canada. That's your bio. Like,
Yeah, with the cat. Yeah,
with
exactly.
the cat. Exactly. Yeah. Congratulations on Amnion, which was a Poetry Book Society recommendation. Beautiful book published on Granta. The Good Ship, steered by the good Rachel Allen. It's a wonderful book. I read it once and then I started going through it again because it felt like an epic film. It's so cinematic going through the whole. It felt like a kind of a novel as a poem. Like, it was so weird. Like, I've got a bag of questions that I want to talk to you about. But for those who don't know what the book does, I guess rather than me kind of regurgitating my spiel, do you want to give people a kind of rough synopsis of what the book is doing and how it does it?
Yeah, I think it's funny because I've been like doing my first events, and people ask me about things in the book that I had almost forgotten were in there. So I'm like, oh yeah, I tried to make my book do a lot of things. No, the book is about my family history, which I had lots of anecdotes in my family history which really preoccupied me, and there's a lot of there are some painful fractures in my family history, and I wanted to kind of gather up all the odds and ends and put them in one place and create a portrait of a family that does have where people have been disowned from their own families and that operate at several removes from kind of standard lineages. And I wanted to honor that. So that's what the book is about.
Yeah, and I think it's so layered and kind of interwoven. It actually reminded me a little bit of 100 Years of Solitude, like with the characters moving in and out and people kind of doing different things and having different experiences, but then it all feeding back from the grandparents to the grandfathers, just move, and then to the mothers and the father. Like, I think that layering, that texturing really does an incredible job. But the first thing that I want to talk about really is your relationship to the essay, because this is something that is very prevalent throughout the book, is that the registers move from being quite essayistic and prosaic to this kind of, this high register, this poetic exuberance. How did you go about balancing what essentially 2-3 different sounds in the book?
Oh, I'm not sure I mean, thank you. I'm not sure I did. I think I had, much like the material I was working with of my family history, I had lots of like jigsaw pieces, and so I did a lot of kind of putting chunks of the text side by side and seeing what happened and kind of reordering it and trying to really trying to make sure that there was a rationale for why one thing was in one place, but also just sort of seeing the kind of mycelial networks that emerged between bits of the text. And I wanted to drop in and out of certain registers, I think, because I wanted this to be this is my attempt to sort of impress upon other people my own fascinations with things like anecdotes. I mean, we all have them in our families, but they sort of die with the teller or with the teller's grandchild at most. The oldest anecdote I can think of is that my history teacher at school told me that his great-grandmother, or maybe his great-great-grandmother, she'd been a really young child during the like Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War, and so Paris was under siege and they started to kill all the zoo animals, and she remembers eating part of the elephant. But like that's the furthest arcing anecdote that I know of in my very flawed like kind of research into anecdotes and kind of living memory, and how far back it can stretch, and therefore how vivid the past is to us. Like the World War II is obviously much more vivid to me than World War One, because I still have a living relative who remembers it.
And it's that hybridity, and it is a hybrid form. Like I was you read it and you feel it's different modes, it's different styles, it's different registers that are all, like you say, maybe it's an unconscious thing. I just found it so artful in the way that it was all merged together, that I just wanted to really ask about if it was a conscious thing, or if maybe you working as an essayist and your relationship to prose writing, how that kind of allowed the anecdote, as you say, to really come to life in the poem. Because I think so much is driven around the anecdote. Could also be memory, the idea of remembering, and how we go about and we talked about it with Ian, preserving, and how we go about archiving, be it social history or be it family history, and how poetry becomes an important vehicle, or maybe a conducive vehicle for making that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, when I wanted to make my point very forcefully, I would, or in a way where, I wanted people to come to the text and think like, oh, I'm supposed to take this a certain way, or like give it a certain kind of attention. And so it was funny because I started writing the book in prose, and then it just didn't really have the kind of heft that I wanted it to. I want it to basically read as if I had like chiseled the whole thing into stone, i.e. it's like, okay, that took someone an incredibly long time. This is a text that commands our attention and that commands our well, if I say reverence, that sounds completely self-aggrandizing, but it commands a certain pace. And, I was very fascinated by when you walk past just plaques, like in the built environment, that will be like, on this day, so-and-so fell, like when you go to the Peterloo Massacre, the site of the Peterloo Massacre, for instance, I find that incredibly moving because it's a very small monument in the built environment, and yet it commemorates this event and, ideas worth fighting for and people who ended up dying in doing so. And I wanted the text to have a similar prosody of, this, it was very effortful, but it was very, very pared back, and hopefully a text that's also, I hope, designed to reach lots of different people from lots of different walks of life.
Yeah, and reaching people, I think, is part of everyone. That's what everyone wants, right? Like, you write a book and you want it to reach people. The question, as I was going through it, and it's something that I actually think about a lot and I've spoken about before, but I think with this book there was something quite pertinent with the idea that, so this is part of the territory of the book as opposed to about the book itself. What do you think about telling other people's stories? And we become the biographers, essentially, of like the grandparents and the great grandparents, and some of those stories are quite painful. Some of them might have elements of shame and things that they might have not disclosed had they been alive, or had they had the chance to talk about it. What do you think? Is there a sensitivity? Is it our story now because we're essentially part of that extended family? What do you think about it?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm not sure I have a firm answer that I feel 100% good about, to be completely honest. But no, I mean, for me, it was very important when I was writing this book that I didn't sit each one of my family members down and dig for information. All of the material in this book is given from material that they surrendered to me. And I guess, subsequently they realized I'd been paying a lot more attention than they might have thought. Yeah, so that was very important to me, to just kind of like gather the flotsam rather than to go looking for it too hard and to be too extractive, because I think that would weigh too heavily on my conscience, to know that I had kind of taken the stories from them. And then with regards to, is it mine? I mean, one thing that was interesting was that I sent the manuscript to both of my grandmothers, well, to my parents first, and then both of my grandmothers, to say, do I have your blessing to continue with, trying to get this published? And I'm not actually interested in whether or not I've made any, minor factual inaccuracies, whether there are any, but I want to know whether you think I've kind of mishandled this in a really fundamental way, and handled your story very badly. And it was very interesting because I got an email from one of my grandmothers sort of listing all the factual inaccuracies. But then tacit within that email was, you have my blessing. And that was such a beautiful gift. And it was one of the most profound interactions I've ever had with her. And it was amazing. And then my other grandmother, I had a phone call with her where she was much more agitated, and she went through every single reference to herself in the text and checked it, and, expressed some unhappiness with some of my turns of phrase and stuff. And also from a more general perspective, so there's a bit later in the text about the Gnostic Gospels where I describe that in language which is deliberately crude, and she objected to that quite strongly, but where I thought, well, that's your opinion. It's not, that's not a piece of text which is about you, so it's staying. And anyway, and then actually what I did was, before I sent the manuscript to my agent, was I copy and pasted basically the email from one grandmother and transcribed the phone call from the other one and put them at the end of the book. So they're the first two sections of the last part of the book, which I'll see if I can find. And that was just a way for me to kind of let them have the last laugh and hand it back to them. And it leaves this, so these two sections here, Bala'e 1 and Bala'e 2, at the start of the epilogue. And so I felt that was just a way of, as I say, handing it back to them, and leaving this question open of whose story is it really, and what rights do we have over the stories that we gather about people other than ourselves. And that was very important to me, and I felt quite at peace with that decision afterwards.
Yeah, it's something that I think we have to work around quite a lot, and the ethics of how you go about, the delicacy maybe of how you go about handling that kind of information. Because I know that people that work very much around trauma or around child abuse, like they implicate the perpetrators that sometimes are people very close to them. But then at the same time, the flip side to the argument is that they are also the victims of something, or they were involved in that. So, there are two people here, three people here, four people here. So I'm interested in how each poet grapples with family history, and how much they give and how much they kind of keep private. Do you want to read something from the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually just, when you were talking about thinking that it was cinematic, I was just flicking through to a section in the book which Rachel said felt very cinematic to her when she was editing the text. It's about the death of my grandfather, who was a Catholic priest, and he met my grandmother. They fell in love, and that meant that he was expelled from the church in very humiliating and traumatic circumstances, and he never recovered. And if you're a devout Catholic, like, something like that will put you in a position of mortal sin, which means that you can't take communion and you have no hopes of getting into heaven, which was obviously something very important to him. So he lived in a state of mortal sin for 40 years, and then he died of cancer, very aggressive cancer, and so he became very determined to get a pardon from Rome, which is when you kind of apply to the Vatican and it makes its way up through the canon lawyers. And what's amazing is that it comes, if you get one, it comes in the form of a piece of paper. So it's quite medieval and quite bizarre. It's like very bureaucratic. And my mum, who's an only child and who was only 33, she doesn't understand why he was, it meant that she didn't get to spend those last few months with him. So that's, I think, all you need to know for this section. My mother had been told that although these were dark days, she would have some of the best conversations of her life with her father. But she did not, because he became determined to receive a pardon regarding the frocking from Rome. Much paperwork was done to sort out his damnation, and soon enough the Pope himself forgave him, and 4 days later my grandfather died. Clearing out afterwards, my mother gave away the antique crucifix that had hung always over his bed. In the hospital, he was strapped to the bed by his wrists. The day he died, our mother dropped my brother off with family. My mother dropped my brother and I off with family friends, and we swam naked in their pool. If our nudity leaps out to you as an odd detail, know that I include it to be indicative of the fact that she forgot our swimming trunks. She left fast. When our mother came back from the hospital at lunch, the call came from Nana that he had died. I do not remember being told. Curtis and Irina sat her down and would not let her leave until she had eaten something. It will not matter, they told her, if you get there half an hour or an hour after it has happened. But you must eat something. So she did. What do you eat when you know that 16 or so kilometers from you, the body of your father grows colder by the minute and lies strapped to a bed by its wrists? You must eat now, because later you will forget, they told her. Then she got in the car and drove. The road is long, largely flat, with groves of olive trees on either side, and a wide expanse to the left, which stretches away towards salt farms and then the sea. She says that she started driving, and then she cried and cried and cried, and while she cried, she felt his presence all around her, in the car and in the sky, and hovering just above the hills and the road, and as she prayed as she had never prayed before in her life or since, that if heaven was there, that it take him, that it take good care of him, that it make him feel welcome and keep him safe. It was the Ides of July, and so the heat would have wavered and parted over the road, and the trees would have thronged with scores of cicadas strumming their wings. There would have been a hot, dry wind smelling of coniferous trees. The afternoon sun would have bounced off the tarmac. I think of my mother driving bare-armed in a sleeveless scarlet shirt, with a tortoiseshell hairslide and tortoiseshell sunglasses, and her long gold auburn hair beating in the headrest's slipstream.
Yeah, I was fully, I was fully involved. I was like, yeah, go on, carry on. That was amazing. It's so like it's mesmeric. Like it really just kind of, it's almost. I was trying to, as you were reading it, I heard you read at the Burley Fisher thing at the festival there, and there's something, and I don't know if it's the ease of the language, but then the ideas that the language are invoking, and I don't know if it's that kind of marriage that just pull you in. It's so weird. It's a very strange experience, a great experience, but yeah, it's just really like it's great. Like it was amazing. Yeah, I'm kind of I've lost my.
Rachel jokes that I'm really good at describing people driving. That there are like good driving poems in here.
I mean, if it was like an audio book, I would listen to it. Like it has that kind of acoustic quality that you could listen to it and really experience it in a particular. I've read it and I've heard you read parts of it. Yeah, it's nuts.
Well, yeah, it's funny you should say that actually, because I think that acoustics did figure in my thinking a lot. a lot of the kind of seeds of this were sown when I was at boarding school, a cathedral school where we had to go to church every week and we sang hymns in assembly every day. And so like the acoustics of a human voice in a structure built of stone was something that I did kind of think about a lot. And then also a lot of the book was written as I was walking around. So I would kind of sound lines of it out as I was walking at a certain pace or chopping a vegetable or, you know, whatever. And so kind of the quite mundane rhythms and the acoustics of yourself in differing built environments, I would say informed my thinking quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it feels very much in tune with your natural speaking voice. So how you're talking now, it doesn't, there's no, you know how some people have poet voice, and that poet voice is its own thing, for good or for worse. But I think with this one, it's very much like it has a natural conversational tone that I think that's maybe the allure. That's what kind of brings you in. But then, you know, like somebody wrote, it sounds like prose, but the language, like the subtext, is so weighted that that's what lends itself to the poetry. And obviously in the book, it's all in stanzas. You haven't written it as a book of prose. It's all kind, and that's that formalism on the page as well that creates an added layer of complexity to, I think, the poem, the book's kind of argument maybe, and the things that it's invested in. The thing that I noticed, and it happens and then it doesn't happen, and it happens and it doesn't happen, is the idea of shortcoming, turmoil, tension, and restoration. There's always, like, it's not a complete like tragedy safari. That it, like, you know, there's some sad stuff that happens, but then there's love there. Like there's love in so many places, where just as it starts to get pretty intense, and that last bit at the end, you know, that whole outpouring, the love sequence. And then, is that your grandparents or your mum and dad who you've got on the photograph?
Oh yeah, that's my parents' wedding photo. Isn't it just the best? I'm very biased, obviously, but
yeah, that's great.
I do love it.
It's so good. And that last kind of, like, I don't know, an ode, a ballad, I don't know how you want to kind of, but it really does send the book out on this beautiful, like, orchestral note.
Well, thank you. That's so kind.
No, yeah, it's I mean, it's amazing. That's what I'm thinking about, is that tension between the polarization, and if that was a conscious thing, did you want to have a kind of woe is me, or was it something of like a more balanced depiction?
No, I think it was very important to me to emphasize love and resilience and hope, because I am very troubled by how literary establishments can kind of take groups who are underrepresented in literary canons, you know, historically, and then kind of, it's sort of a, like, you know, make them dance scenario, you know, like, tell me about your traumas, like, make me empathize with you. I'm, you know, and I need a lot to empathize. And so the kind of the public excavation of trauma, which of course can have immense value, I do find that quite troubling, because I think it's not always done in a very caring or nurturing way. And I am more interested in, well, maybe that's a very callous way to phrase it, but I think that, Alice Hiller is someone I really look to on this as well. Joy and love and resilience are a more important marker of who we are and reflect our true selves better. And in that regard, I am more interested in those things. So, you know, for instance, as you mentioned, you know, the kind of closing section of the book is about my parents getting married, yes, which, you know, on the face of it is a traditional thing to do. Marriage is a very bourgeois institution which underpins society. But it was also a radical act of the imagination for them. And it was how they embarked on this very beautiful project of chosen family and creating these kind of constellational kinship systems that they have modeled for me my whole life. And that has been just the greatest gift, I think. And so I wanted to kind of reorient the ceremony of marriage from basically, you know, traditionally an exchange of property to actually, no, you know, we invite our nearest and dearest to weddings. And I say this as an unmarried person. I sort of was quite fascinated by the ceremony. We invite our nearest and dearest to weddings to say, you know, it's thanks, this is about my love for all of you, just as much as it's about my love for the person I'm exchanging vows with, because actually I want to recognize that it's because of all of you and your support that I'm able to kind of embark on this crazy adventure. And also that friendship is just this completely unsanctified love in our culture, because it's unproductive and it's not conducive to the consolidation of material wealth. And for that reason, I think it is one of the best kinds.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the idea of the unit and the family, I used the term extended family before, and friendships and kinships and things like this, but it all feels part of that kind of nucleus, that central organism that keeps everyone alive, which I think is really quite beautiful. And that's one of the great feats of the book, is how it manages to balance voices and stories from different parts of the world. It's international in so many ways, and it spans epochs and decades from where it starts to where it finishes. So the kind of arc, the trajectory that the book takes is pretty amazing. I recommend everyone here to read Stephanie's book. I read a lot of poetry, and this one was something that just made me want to read it twice, which doesn't happen a lot because I'm trying to get through everything. And it's a nice, beautiful volume, blurbed by Will Harris and Shane McCree, published on Granta. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to read your bio now, and then I'm going to just give a quick plug, and then we're going to go. That's if my mouse works. Okay, it does. Stephanie Sy-Quia was born in 1995 in California and now lives in London. She studied English at Oxford and currently works as a freelance journalist. Her writing has appeared in the FT Weekend, the TLS, The Economist, The Spectator, and Tank magazine, and has twice been shortlisted for the FT Bodley Head Essay Prize. Bodley,
I think.
Yeah, Bodley. I think it's Bodley. Bodley Head Essay Prize. And just to say, for those who are still tuned in, Alice from the PBS has said that for those of you who are thinking to join for Black Friday, PBS are going green. And so they're planting a tree for every new member. They just need to buy, all you need to do is buy a PBS membership, which ranges from 4 to 24 books a year, depending on your chosen tier, and enter the code Green Friday at the checkout from now until Monday. So yes, for every membership, PBS will plant a tree, which is fantastic. What an initiative. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Ian. It was remarkable, amazing to talk to both of you. These are the two books right here. Fantastic books. Get those in. Christmas is coming. Capitalism is here. So we might as well take advantage. Cool. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's listened. And yes, we shall be back next month with the last PBS Insta Book Club of the year. And I'm going to upload this as well, so everyone can watch this back with notes if they so wish. Stephanie, Ian, thank you. And I shall see you around, I guess, at the next poetry thing.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Take care. See you later. Bye-bye.